Okay, so this will be the first in a series of tutorials about using cloners, duplicates, to make animation. And I'm a big fan of this idea of systems. I too currently direct the School of Art. So as administrator, I'm always thinking about systems, whether it's financial, curricular, or human, as it relates to how pieces fit together. So sometimes I find my way into the animation and creative software. I'm also like to apply those ideas and think about that. So the first part of the semester we talked a lot about keyframe animations, and certainly we'll do some keyframing, but the idea here is to create a system that's going to drive a lot of these animations and done in such a way that we can make quick changes or pop new items, new effects into the pipeline and watch how those play out. So anyways, we're going to start this first one by, in essence, making a set of stairs that animate very quickly, and then we'll look at maybe in a part two how to take that idea of kind of stepped repetition to do something a little more aesthetically interesting. Okay, so first place, let's just start with a primitive, and let's just make a cube. And because we started with these dimensions at the very first of the semester for our boxy rig, I'm going to make the cube 30 by 30 by 30 centimeters. Just place it here in the center of the screen. Okay, so I have a cube, right? So I have like a prototype of something that I can build from. So the next part of this would be I need to clone from it. So if let's change this actually. Well, I'll leave it at the animation layout here. So if I want to add this to a cloner, I can do this two ways. As with all things Cinema 4D, I can hold down the Option key, and if I click on the cloner, it will automatically add it to the object manager, and it will take the object that was selected, the cube, and make it a child of it, right? So it does the parenting for us, and that's what we need for the clone. In fact, any of these green items here, these are generators. So the generators sit on top of the object, and they generate clones or subdivision surfaces or whatever that might be. Later on, we'll look at a different set that actually becomes a child of something, kind of. Okay, so I have, you notice immediately I got a cloner object, and I now have 9 cubes in the scene. So this is just the default for Cinema 4D to do a grid array, and it says, hey, let's make this 3 by 1 by 3, and I can change this and make this whatever I would like it to be. I can add more or less, and then the default mode is per step. I would most of the time find that to be the mode that you would use. It's just easiest. So so it's every time it's created a clone, it's put 200 centimeters in between each one of the clones. And there are multiple formats, right? So we can put it in a grid array, an object, so we can put the clones on top of a different object. For a later tutorial, we'll look at that. Linear, radial, grid array, which is what we're using as the default, and the honeycomb array, which is kind of like an offset grid. But we're just going to use a linear as the default, or for this one, it's not the default, but for this tutorial. And you can see I have 3 or however many copies, but 3 is just the default setup, just so that we can see like what is the cloner doing. Well, it's going to make 3 copies, and they happen to be moving in the Y direction, 50 units total, right? So these, whenever you're using cloners, it's the offset here is that total amount, right? In that setup. So I actually don't want it to move in the Y. I want this to move along the ground, and I'm going to move it in the Z direction. And I made each of these 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. So I'm going to make that the per step, right? So each time it goes, it's going to make it go 30 centimeters. And let's go ahead and make 10 copies. And just so they're easy to see, maybe I'll go ahead and say ground shading lines, so I can see each one of the copies, right? So this is the beginning of this. One thing is, as we mentioned, I want to make a set of stairs. So the size here is 30 centimeters. I'm going to make that 90, just so I get something that is more stair-like, right? Okay, so I have these cubes laid out in the scene, but they're also, well, I'm just going to leave that, but you'll notice that they are running through the floor, or the grid, right, in this case. We'll come back to that idea. Okay, so I've made these copies in here with the cloner, and which is fine. And within the cloner itself, there are some ways to modify how these kind of steps happen with the rotation, right? So I can do something like this. So every time it creates a copy, let's rotate so many degrees, but I'm just going to leave that alone. So we're going to use an effector to change and modify these existing clones, right? So I have 10 of them, that's fine in this instance, but they're not really doing anything unique, right? So if I click on the clone, I have the basic, kind of self-explanatory, and the coordinates. We've been using that, so I could, move the whole community of clones to another location. I have the object, which is the basic settings for the cloner. Transform, I'm not going to really talk about. And then these effectors, which just looks like in a window here. So these are what the name says, right? I'm going to affect the clones. And so where do I find those effectors? And it's important to remember I have the cloner selected. So if I go back up to the clone menu here, you can see these green ones are the generators, but I also have these blue ones, which are the effectors, right? They have some kind of effect on all the clones and how they behave and move and distribute themselves. And we're going to use the step effector. You can see right now we have 1, 2, 3 little cubes in this little icon for the step effector. And already you can see that we get something kind of similar. So what's happening here is it created a step effector. It's like an object. And for the cloner, it put it into this effectors window. So if let's say I didn't have anything selected, and I just went up and say, hey, what's the step effector? What does it do? And I didn't really see anything happen. If I check my clone, you can see the effector was not loaded. It's kind of like making it a child, but not really, right? So I'm just going to say, hey, the thing that's going to do the effector is this step. And you'll notice that it says effectors, plural. We can put multiples of these in here later on. And as I mentioned in class, the order of these things sometimes make a difference. Hopefully we won't run into that in this kind of intro class, but it's worth noting. Okay, so if I click on the step effector, it has its own set of, again, basic coordinate. We're not even worried about that, but it has a strength. It has a spline that controls how the steps are moving, right? So this would be a linear interpolation. So it takes the amount of stepping to get to at the end, and then it divides that, each little step, to get to that final goal. So you can use this. It's very effective, right? A way to tweak something that's a little more organic. But we'll come back to that. The main thing here is the parameter. So when you use an effector, usually it has one of these transform effectors turned on as a default, so that we have, we'd either see what the position is doing. I could make them move up in space if I wanted to, right? Or whatever it might be. In this case, the default for the step effector is scale. And if I make this larger, in fact, let's make it 10, right? You can see I'm getting, each time it makes a copy, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not really kind of close to what I'm looking for the steps, because right now the uniform scale is turned on. So I'm going to turn that off so that I can treat, what the scaling is for each one of these axes. And in this case, we just want the staircase to get taller, right? We want the steps to get taller. So let's go ahead and just say 5, maybe. Let's say 10. Okay, so it's making this scale on the y direction step and increase, so it goes from a scale of 1 to a scale of 10. But we do have a problem here, is that if we're just trying to make a set of stairs, and we're not trying to make stairs for an M.C. Escher illustration, we don't want stairs going through on the bottom side, right? And again, maybe you would want something like this if you're trying to build something else, but for a set of stairs, this is incorrect. So maybe you would think, well, what I need to do is just move the cube so that it's in, I move it up from the center, and that would move it so that it doesn't scale, on the bottom and the top. And you can see already that doesn't do anything, right? So when we put an object into the cloner at this first level, right, because I can't put multiple objects in here, but for now, if I just have that the clone, I can't move the transform for this. This is just situated where it is, and it treats it as a 0, 0 coordinate space. And then that's how it just builds the clones off of it. So how do I modify this, right? Okay, so let's go up and create a null object. And I'm going to put the null into the cloner. And interestingly enough, you can see that it seems to have gotten rid of every other one. Because what's happening with the cloner, if I look at its object, it says linear, and the way that it's going to create clones is to iterate. So it's going to go clone 0, clone 1, clone 0, clone 1, clone 0, clone 1. And since the null object is nothing, you can see that it skips it, right? It doesn't even skip it. It puts it in there, but there's no geometry attached to it. So this is a very important part of the system of how the clones are either, if we iterate or if we make it random, which one it chooses within this list. Or how it sorts. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I'm not going to talk about that, but let's just leave it at iterate, which was the default. And really, I don't want the clone to just sit here by itself. I want it to be the thing being cloned, and then I want the cube to be a child of it, right? So now, if I select the cube and I move it, right, you can see that the object is being scaled from where the clone is, down here at the bottom. In fact, let's turn this to, let's just make it a circle, right? So I just changed the icon representation for the null, and you'll see that it's there it is, right? It's a circle, and then the scaling is happening from its location, right? So it's this one, right? It's scaling from here, from the bottom. So I want to line this up perfectly. I don't want this gap here at the bottom. Excuse me, let's resituate here. So I made the cube 30 units tall, so if I go back to the coordinates and I just make it 15 units from up from the center, right, that will position it so that with this first cube, the bottom half of it will sit exactly where the null object is. So let's just recap this. There's a couple things to keep in mind. If you're animating a set of objects, you always want to put it into a null and then put the null into the cloner. So this moves wherever the cloner tells it to, and it also protects the other stuff inside of here, and you can move it and transform it where it needs to be, right? So there's a relationship that goes on between these. I can't stress how important this is in understanding how cloners work, this idea of kind of the offset from the transformation. So that cloner is, is home base, and then we put that clone in there. The other thing too is because we scaled it now just in one direction, you can see the stairs are twice as tall because it's not scaling it down and up at the same time. It's put all the scale information. And that's a pretty steep set of stairs. I used to frame houses. These would not pass code. So I'm going to go back into the cloner, or the step effector, right? So this is the one deciding how much increased scaling is happening as it gets taller. And I'm going to actually turn it into 5. So I get these shorter stairs. It could be anything, right? I could make it 6, something that just looks more reasonable as a set of stairs. Okay, that's about 15 minutes. So I'm going to stop this and I'll go on to part 2, but let's just recap a little bit. So we created an object, a clone. We gave it a certain size. We parented it to a null so that we could position where we want the scaling to happen. This would also be if we wanted to, say, change, if I go back into the step effector, I could also change the rotation, right? So let's see if this was 90 degrees. You can see all that scaling, or all that rotating is happening from, let's move in here a little bit. Let's make the null. I think this will be helpful to see it, actually. Basic color on, let's choose red. Oops, did it do it? To color on. Maybe it doesn't obey the little cloner. That's interesting. So you can see those circles that are in there, right? So that's where the null is. You can see they're just staying put, and they're pivoting or rotating from that point, right? So we get this interesting shape. The other thing I'll mention is when we use the step effector, whatever number I put in here, this is the total amount, right? So when I say scale of 5, by the time it does however many clones we have in there, the last one will be scaled a total of 5 or 500%, however you want to look at that, by the last one. Here we've said by the time you get to the very last copy, however many copies there are, right, scale it 90 degrees. If I went up to the cloner and told it to have a whole bunch of copies, right, it would still end up in that same amount, right? It just decreases how many increments happen along the way. Right, this is very important. If you're trying to get something that seems like, what if I wanted to rotate 90 degrees every single time? Well, I'll count how many times it steps, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, there's 10 clones, but it makes 10 steps from the beginning to the end. So if I went into the step effector parameter here and I said 90 degrees times 9, you can actually do a little bit of programming, a little bit of math, right, into the number field, right? And so now we get this shape, which is interesting but a little bit different. But what's happening is every time that it rotates, it's rotating 90 degrees, right? So if I took 810 divided by 9, that's what I would get. I could have done the math maybe in my head, but I wanted to show that you can figure this out with, this is a little calculator if you want to use it. Okay. So this is the end total for any one of these in the step effector, right? And we made sure that the step effector was loaded into the cloner. I can turn it on and off to see what it's doing. Obviously a lot of other parameters, but we'll save that for the next tutorial.